across from Mexico into what's now Arizona, and then onward across the southwestern plains. This was, a major, really, invasion of what's now the U.S. by this magnificent force that then limps home a few years later in tatters. That's another aspect of this story. We think of Europeans as kind of heedlessly steamrolling the native peoples. In fact, in this era, most of the Europeans who come here fail. They're either driven off by natives or, kill themselves, starve themselves, or in some cases turn to cannibalism. And when they're not killing natives, they're killing each other. So it's also really a story of repeated failures.
There are a lot of historians working in Detroit in the car industry, which is why they're always calling cars after after people like DeSoto or...
Right.
Well, let's talk about DeSoto.
Cool. Yeah, DeSoto to me is in some ways the most fascinating figure I dealt with because he's so monstrous. This was a man who really led a death march across the entire South in search of gold that he never found, and in the process killed half his men, untold thousands of Indians, and eventually himself. He's kind of a Spanish Ahab, this sort of a mad figure chasing this dream until it destroys him. And he has a really devastating impact on the region through both outright killing and combat, but more importantly through introducing European diseases to these densely settled parts of America that had never been exposed to them, and really in the decades that follow, just shocking depopulation of the area due to these diseases.
Well, let's tell the listener he goes north from Florida into Georgia, South Carolina, back through Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, the north of the Mississippi, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. Boy, did he get about.
Covers, roughly about 3,000 miles before he dies, and then his men continue on for another year. So the whole thing goes on for about 4 years and roughly 4,000 miles, almost all on foot, dragging along this heavy armor. And mind you, they essentially created the first chain gang in the South by literally chaining Indians together at the neck to carry their bags. So they did have servants or slaves, really. But still, it's quite an incredible feat, even if one doesn't admire DeSoto the man. Your jaw has to kind of drop at what they did.
He eventually dies in what is now Arkansas. Is there a monument to him there? Is he fondly remembered?
No. The problem with this history is a long time ago, and except for rare spots, it's hard to pinpoint, and say DeSoto slept here. There are a few places you can do that, but by and large, we know the general area, but can't know the exact spot, and the terrain has changed. According to the accounts of his men, and we have several, he was put in either a crude coffin or a hollowed-out log and thrown into the Mississippi because the Spanish didn't want the Indians to know he died because they feared this would prompt an attack. So they hid his death by sort of sneaking his corpse off in the night.
Tony, it's amazing how quickly we forget what we've lived through ourselves. Ken Inglis was the ABC's official historian. These days he just keeps doing it out of force of habit. And he recently published a book on the last 20 years or so here at the ABC, which I'd lived through, but I'd forgotten 80% of it. And I was so grateful to Ken for actually reminding me of what we'd endured. It doesn't take long, does it?
No, I mean, all memory is selective, and I think that's true for nations as for individuals. And we tend to, either forget simply out of forgetfulness, but more often, in the case of national memory, we pick and choose, and we tend to remember the stories that perhaps make us feel good. And in this country, therefore, this sort of obsessive focus, say, on the Founding Fathers and the Civil War and World War II are kind of the big three in our history that we keep coming back to, and we tend to forget the messier or less flattering stories. For instance, this period where there's a lot of killing and mayhem. It's not a particularly nice story to...
We're really talking the history of the theme park, aren't we? We're talking that sort of glorification and romanticization of moments of the past.
Exactly, and I think all countries do this. I just think perhaps the U.S. is more guilty of it than most, and it was really astonishing for me to discover as a sort of someone who thought of himself as a history buff since early childhood that I didn't have a clue really about this huge chapter of our history, and it is kind of shocking that we really are taught myths, and then we become very invested in them. Once they're in place, it's almost impossible to dislodge them.
You spent a lot of time here, of course, Tony, and are well aware of the struggles to in the last decade or so to get Australians interested in Indigenous history, and there's another area which has been largely forgotten in the United States, the incredibly complex history of the 500 nations.
Well, absolutely. And again, one of the biggest myths, I think, that endures in America is that somehow when Europeans arrived, this was, as the Pilgrims referred to it, sort of a virgin wilderness, or a howling wilderness.
Terra nullius comes to mind.
Exactly. And in fact, this was, a very well-populated continent, and it's in the European accounts as well as the archaeological record. The population, if you take all the Americas, not just North America, was probably larger than Europe at the time that Columbus arrived in 1492. So this is, a myth that somehow there were just a few, roaming nomads chasing.
And you had major cities in what is now continental United States.
Yeah,
not just in Aztec or Incan America.
Exactly. One of them, a place called Cahokia in near what's now St. Louis, that had more than 20,000 people, which doesn't sound huge to us today, but that was larger than any city in North America until Philadelphia surpassed it in the late 1700s. So these were major settlements, very sophisticated societies that were, pretty much wiped out very quickly. But they did exist at the time that Europeans arrived.
It seems to me, we've only got seconds left, that the most raked over moment in American history isn't so much the Founding Fathers as the Civil War. Yeah. When you talk about reenactments or the massive amounts of film and and popular writing, popular history.
Right. Well, someone calculated that I think since Appomattox, which is sort of more or less the end of the Civil War, the number of books is such that it would be as if one book had been published every day since Appomattox on the Civil War. That's how many books there are out on it, and I contributed to that overkill. But it really is amazing that.
Well, you've redeemed yourself now, Tony, because the new book is trailblazing. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and writer Tony Horwitz, and the book, which comes highly recommended, A Voyage Long and Strange. It's Rediscovering the New World, published